To date, there have been 62 members of the Royal Artillery who have been awarded the Victoria Cross. This is an award bestowed upon members of the British or Commonwealth Armed Forces for acts of valour or gallantry performed in the face of the enemy. It is the highest award a soldier can receive for actions in combat in the British Armed Forces. It was established in 1856 by Queen Victoria to reward acts of valour during the Crimean War, and it is to that war that we will look today. Welcome to the Ardent Gunner. The Crimean War was fought between the defending Russians on one side and the British, French and Ottomans on the other, an imperial spat in which the British and French wished to limit Russian expansion into the slowly collapsing Ottoman Empire. The landing in Crimea in September 1854 had the objective of capturing Sevastopol, the Russians' main naval base in the Black Sea, in order to severely reduce its influence in that area. It had been the step-off point for an attack on Sinope, now in northern Turkey, in November 1853, and was critical in moving Russian troops between the various fronts. After victory at the Battle of Alma on the 20th of September 1854, following the initial landings, the Anglo-French army marched south and laid siege to Sevastopol. It is during the initial months of this siege that the Crimean War's most famous actions would take place, namely the Battle of Balaclava and the Battle of Inkerman. The Battle of Balaclava, on the 25th of October 1854, would be an attempt by the besieged Russian army to capture the Allied supply base and lift the siege. Whilst the attack was rebuffed, it is most famous in Britain for the charge of the Light Brigade, immortalised in the poem by Alfred Tennyson. The morning of the 5th of November 1854 was cold, and a heavy fog lay over the ground. The Anglo-French forces had been besieging Sevastopol for over a month at this point, and were still considering the losses taken at Balaclava. The Allied army was broken down into divisional camps spread around the city. The 2nd Division's soldiers, under Brigadier Pennefather, were fighting the rain as they looked to get their fires lit, kettles filled, and breakfast cooked. None would have realised that this very ground would, by the end of the day, be immortalised in their regimental histories. Lieutenant Frederick Miller would have been located in the 4th Division's artillery camp with the remainder of P Battery. Born in Radway, Warwickshire, and the son of a cavalry officer, his 2 brothers were both in the army as well. At the time of the battle, he was 22 years old and commanding one of the 3-gun divisions of the battery. Another skill of his was for drawing and painting, based on the requirement for all artillery officers to be competent cartographers at the time. Some of his work will be included throughout this video. Meanwhile, further north, at the 2nd Division camp, G Battery's Sergeant Major Andrew Henry would have been beginning the day in a similar fashion. Born in Woolwich, London in 1823, the 31-year-old warrant officer had served in the army for over 16 years. Today would be slightly less ordinary for him. Earlier that morning, and unknown to the Allied forces, the Russian 10th Division had broken camp and marched towards Inkerman. For them, Balaclava had shown how thin the Allied siege lines were, and they aimed to lift the siege by attacking in force at an unexpected point in the line to break the Allied armies. Lieutenant General Soimanov, with 35,000 men and 134 guns, joined with other Russian elements to create an assault force of 42,000 men. Facing them were 2,700 men of the British 2nd Division with 12 guns. Marching before dawn, they planned to use the fog to further mask their advance, with the hope of overwhelming the British 2nd Division before assistance could arrive. The 2nd Division's pickets, however, were on alert that morning. They managed to identify the Russian advance early, and the 2nd Division would be well prepared when the initial advance of approximately 6,000 men came. The British 2nd Division were arrayed on a high feature known as Home Ridge. This included 2 batteries of the Royal Artillery. The firing in the valley gave warning to Brigadier Pennefather, the acting divisional commander of the 2nd Division, of the beginning of a general action. He was a highly aggressive officer, always inclined to the attack, and would immediately send all units to the 2nd Division forward to engage the Russian columns. His actions were absolutely appropriate for the day, even though he was committing a small number of troops to battle against overwhelming odds. The Russian heavy artillery, located on Shell Hill, opened a bombardment of the 2nd Division's position and camp on Home Ridge, whilst the masses of their infantry would advance. The infantry fight was savage. Critically, the British mini-rifle gave a significant advantage in range, accuracy, and reloading speed over the Napoleonic-style muskets still in use by the majority of the Russian army. The British willingness to fix bayonets and charge, even against great odds, was also displayed throughout the morning. The rain and damp still made the mini-rifle inoperable at times, and a number of actions would see a few hundred men charging into the massed Russian columns to break them. It was on the slopes around the destroyed 2nd Division camp that innumerable stories of bravery and self-sacrifice would be written. Nicknamed the Soldiers' Battle, this was a reflection of the nature of the engagement, typified by junior officers, NCOs, and men using their initiative and fighting with dogged determination, despite being heavily outnumbered. If the infantry brought itself renown that morning, the same could be said for the Royal Artillery. 12 batteries were a part of Lord Raglan's army in the Crimea, but as with many other infantry and cavalry regiments, many of them would not be directly involved at Inkerman. The 2 batteries belonging to the 2nd Division, Franklin's B Battery and Turner's G Battery, would be heavily involved. Townshend's P Battery of the 4th Division would also join the fight early in the morning, and the arrival of 2 18-pounders from the siege train would prove a critical element of the battle later in the morning. For any gunner, no pride is greater than that taken in its guns. Where the other arms are presented with colours representing the regiment and the crown, the Royal Regiment of Artillery's colours are its guns, and are accorded a similar symbolic status to those colours found in other regiments. For gunners of any nation, whether this is the case or not, the guns are cherished and must never be surrendered lightly. Examples of this mindset include the last stand of the 9th Massachusetts Battery at Gettysburg in 1863, the British 5th Battery Royal Artillery in May 1918 at Bois de Batz, and 155 Battery Royal Artillery at Sidi Nazir in 1943. The guns of the 2nd Division would have been engaging from the first sighting of the Russian columns advancing on Home Ridge, made all the more difficult by the heavy fog that morning. However, the first VC action would come with P Battery, which had quickly advanced from the area of the 4th Division camp on hearing the heavy firing begin to their north. They had rapidly deployed in the vicinity of the 49th and 88th Regiments of Foot on the spur above a valley known as the Miriakoff Glen, orientated north. Both the 49th and 88th Regiments had advanced forward with initial success in the fog before coming upon masses of Russian infantry up to 8 times their number. This necessitated a hasty retreat through the scrub and brush of the glen, followed closely by the pursuing Russian battalions. P Battery's 6 9-pounders under Major Samuel Townsend waited at the top of the spur. For Lieutenant Miller and the detachments of his 3 guns, the first they would have known would have been on seeing the disturbing image of the retreating groups of the 88th running through their position. They would have had little time to react before 2 battalions of the Catherineburg Regiment climbed out of the mist in front of them at close range. The 3 guns had time to fire just 1 round of canister each before the enemy was on them. As Lieutenant Miller recounted, the crest of the hill was covered with smoke, and the entire ground there thickly covered with brushwood, through which we with the greatest difficulty moved the guns. Suddenly the smoke cleared away, and we discovered the Russian infantry in great force within 10 yards of us. I shall never forget the aspect of these fellows, dressed in their long grey coats and flat glazed caps, firing most deliberately at our poor gunners and picking them down like so many crows. Townsend, the battery commander, gave the order to withdraw the battery, but it was too late. Moments later, he was killed by an exploding shell that struck him on the head. The Russian infantry rapidly closed the remaining 10 yards. Not wishing to give up the guns, Lieutenant Miller drew his sword and spurred his horse into them. He cut down first one Russian and then another. His quick action compelled a dozen Russian soldiers to turn back. Meanwhile, Miller's gunners fought furiously, using anything at hand, including their swords, rammers, sponge staffs, and fists to fend off the muskets and bayonets of the attackers. However, the press of massed Russian infantry would push the officer and his men off the guns, with several dying on them. They had lost 3 of their precious cannons. A few hundred yards behind the battery, the 47th Regiment was formed up and preparing for their next task. A drummer of the 47th wrote, "An artillery officer came to us and said, 47th, will you let them take our guns from us?" And we all gave a shout to charge them. My sword was broken in my hand, and I worked away with the bayonet of one of our poor fellows that was killed by my side. The counter-chargers pushed back the enemy and recovered the 3 captured guns. 2 of the guns were found hastily spiked with wooden splinters, and they were restored for firing soon enough. Lieutenant Miller, involved in fighting for the guns and then in retrieving them, would see out the day without a scratch. His citation would read, "For having, at the Battle of Inkerman, personally attacked 3 Russians, and with the gunners of his division of the battery, prevented the Russians from doing mischief to the guns which they had surrounded. Part of a regiment of English infantry had previously retired through the battery in front of this body of Russians." No more than an hour later, Turner's G battery would be in a similar predicament about 500 metres to their east on Home Ridge. Their morning had been spent engaging the main Russian columns at close range in support of the pickets to their front. 6 Russian battalions had advanced through the fog and had pushed back the British pickets who were running low on ammunition. The situation was critical. At one point, Sergeant Conway of Turner's G battery ran forward, bellowing at the pickets to lie down. Though the Russians were almost on them, the pickets obeyed, and over their heads Turner opened with canister. At such close range, the leading battalion was shattered and broke back into the following battalions, eventually holding up the assault of all 6. The Russians would attack again against the hard-pressed Home Ridge. With the savage infantry fight continuing, one party of Russian infantry, quite unobserved, rushed the extreme west end of Home Ridge, where there were 3 unprotected guns of Turner's battery. Some gunners ran, others were killed, but Sergeant Major Henry and Gunner Taylor drew their swords to defend the guns. When the foremost of the enemy's troops had so closely surrounded Henry's guns as to be already but a few paces off, they charged in, undertaking to bayonet the gunners. He and Gunner Taylor drew their swords and stood firm. Henry, with his left hand, wrested a bayonet from one of the Russians and threw the man down, fighting hard all the time with his sword arm against some of his other assailants. Soon, both Henry and Taylor were closed in upon from all sides and bayoneted again and again. Henry was stabbed in the chest and at the same time in his back and arms. From loss of blood, he would become unconscious. He had received a total of 12 wounds. Shortly after this, a company of Zouavi, part of the French forces in Crimea, surprised these Russians from the scrub and drove them from the guns. Sadly, Gunner Taylor would succumb to his wounds on the gun line, but Sergeant Major Taylor would survive and would be awarded the Victoria Cross for this action. Had Gunner Taylor survived, he would undoubtedly have received it as well. So the 2 Gunner Victoria Crosses were won at Inkerman. For the artillery enthusiast, there were further events of note. When Lord Raglan, the overall commander of the British forces, had first arrived on the scene at about 7 a.m, he had ordered up 2 18-pounders from the siege train to supplement the outgunned and outranged field batteries in their uneven duel with the superior numbers of the Russian 12-pounders and 32-pounder howitzers on Shell Hill. The message reached Colonel Gambier, commanding the siege train. He had been keeping 2 guns with loaded ammunition wagons ready for such an eventuality since the 26th of October sortie. Now, however, he had no draft horses to pull them. Accordingly, some men of the 6th and 7th Companies, 11th Battalion Royal Artillery, set to with drag ropes to haul them over 1.5 miles, over rough ground, and up a steep hill to the scene of the action. As they neared the battle, they came under artillery fire, and Gambier was wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Collingwood Dixon, the son of Wellington's artillery commander in the Peninsula, and the first Royal Artillery recipient of a Victoria Cross, awarded for an action only 3 weeks earlier, on the 17th of October 1854, assumed command. Finding some field battery horses, he had the 18-pounders pulled into position on the bend between Home and Four Ridges, facing northwest, where there was an emplacement which afforded some slight protection. The 18-pounder had a long 9-foot iron barrel, which could range accurately out to 2,000 metres. Thus, all the Russian batteries between West and East Juts and on Shell Hill were now within range. The first ranging shot was fired at 9:30 a.m, and the next found its mark. The Russians handily replied with a mass of their guns, and shot flew around the 18-pounders, but the British gunners continued to serve their guns without hesitation in the maelstrom. With both guns laid each time by an officer, their detachments reloading and firing with all haste, and the Russian batteries clear on the skyline, they began to cause such destruction that after a while the enemy battery commanders started to move their guns about, which, with damage and casualties, slowly diminished their volume of fire. Another example of the unwavering commitment of the gunners on this day. The last incident of note is a sombre one. Lord Raglan, having sent word for the 18-pounders, remained on Home Ridge with his staff. One of these was Brigadier General Thomas Fox Strangways. In 1813, while still a lieutenant, the brigadier had commanded the rocket troop at the Battle of Leipzig, the sole British element there. The troop had excelled, capturing several thousand French soldiers, despite only numbering in the few hundreds. The Russian Tsar Alexander I, who was also present at Leipzig, had removed from his coat his own Order of St. Anne medal and presented it to Strangways. Now, in a bizarre twist of fate, he was being fired upon by the armies of that man's son. At around 9:30 a.m, a shell exploded in the midst of the staff officers with Raglan, and took away Strangways' leg. An eyewitness recounted, "The poor old general never moved a muscle of his face. Instead he requested, 'Will anyone be kind enough to lift me off my horse?' Strangways was borne to the rear. Nothing could be done for him, and he lived only 2 more hours. By some accounts, he was still wearing his Russian medal when he died. He would be buried in the Crimea alongside the other gunner officers killed at Inkerman." The Battle of Inkerman would end in victory for the Allied armies. 2nd Division had taken particularly heavy casualties, and in total there were 4,272 killed and wounded in the Anglo-French army. The Russians had lost almost 12,000 men. A firm Anglo-French victory. The scenes following the finish of the battle were sobering for all. Captain Henry Clifford, another VC winner at Inkerman, put it best. "I rode over the field of battle after it was over, and the sight was truly heart-rending. The Russians lay in such heaps, it was quite impossible to form any idea of their numbers. It is said they lost 10,000, but I will not answer for the truth of this report. All I can say is that they were driven back with very much greater loss than ourselves, and never for a moment got possession of any part of our positions. I thought the wounds I saw at Alma were so dreadful I could never see worse, but some of the bayonet wounds and round shot yesterday were far worse. The excitement certainly was tremendous while it lasted, and it is well perhaps it is so, for I am sure in cold blood I never could strike at a man as I did then, and if I had not, in all probability, those with me would not have charged, and we should have lost our lives. All that can be left to say is that there is no doubt that the batteries present around the 2nd Division's camp that day fought well, complementing the determination and bravery of their infantry peers. The heavy casualties among those batteries involved in protecting the guns, as masses of Russian infantry fell upon them, is a fine demonstration of the sanctity afforded to the colours. The 2 Victoria Crosses awarded to Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Major Henry were richly deserved, and represented many more who died stoutly defending by their sides. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time.